Hey everybody, it's 1:30. Welcome to the first Relevant Research Roundtable of the year for the FSU Ad Leadership and Policy Studies Department. Thank you all of you here and virtually for joining us. We're going to run until 2:30 and try to shoot to leave at least 15, if not 20 minutes towards the end for some discussion. And if you have any really pressing questions that you want to clarify during the talk, that might be okay. And if not, any longer discussion questions, we can go to the end. If there are questions coming in online too, we'll also be checking on them and bringing them up. And so thank you all, and to Darren for helping us coordinate this and make this happen. So with no further ado, Dr. Cameron Beatty, Assistant Professor of Higher Education.
Hi everyone, thank you for making time today. Shout out to the social justice and higher ed students I see in here. As Dr. Lepres said, I am a assistant professor. This is my second year here at Florida State, so still learning Florida State, still learning Tallahassee. And I'm teaching in the higher ed program, but also in the undergraduate leadership studies program. And my particular research interest is around undergraduate leadership education, specifically understanding how students of color develop a leadership identity. And then I also look at race and racism in higher education. For me, a relevant research, right? Like for me, how situating myself in this particular study and this research is really thinking about what's happening currently in higher education when thinking about campus climate and how students of color specifically are experiencing the campus climate at historically white institutions specifically. So how many of you remember in 2015, there was an incident at the University of Missouri. And at the University of Missouri, there were some specific racist incidents that were happening on campus. And the students of color were going to the university president at the time, Tim Wise. And Tim Wise, the students did not feel were responding and addressing the racism in which they were experiencing. How it got national media attention was there was a graduate student in the higher ed program that went on a hunger strike for about a week. Media outlets were picking up the story. They convened onto campus, and then there was pressure, and the football team threatened to strike the football game that weekend. Do you remember this? Mm-hmm. And the university was set to lose $1 million+ The football team did not play that weekend. Out of that, the Board of Trustees convened and accepted the resignation of Tim Wise. Is this working? Yeah, click for me. Okay. There was a documentary that the students that were initiating the protest put together, and I would encourage you to take a look when you have time at this documentary. And it's called Concerned Student 1950. We're only going to look at 2 minutes of this particular documentary, and the part that we're looking at is really thinking about what I want you to think about is what does actual racism feel like in higher education. So if we could take a look at this. They might have to mute on their end.
I don't believe so. Let me take care of that.
Promise to work in rehearsal.
I wonder if touching it might work.
Oh.
The touch screen.
Their emotion was very raw. And that's something that we don't always, a lot of times we save our most raw emotions for a smaller group of trusted people, and so it's rare to show it to the public.
As I mentioned before, why I love this particular documentary is because it actually does take you behind the scenes of the activism, right? We oftentimes see the protests, the campus, we see the demands that a student might raise, we see them meeting with university administration, but we oftentimes don't see the strategy behind it, but also the particular burden of what they're experiencing and then how that plays out in their everyday lives. So hence, when thinking about how I landed and thinking about really wanting to explore this, for me, was thinking about all these incidents, and these are not new incidents, but around this time, they were popping up on a number of campuses in the instance of making demands to the university, and so they asking for specific things. So what I was interested in really looking at is we know that campus racial climates become chilly places, quote unquote, as the literature would call it, at historically white institutions for students of color, right? And really thinking about how does the campus climate speak to how students navigate and cope in addition to their identity as students. And for me, what I was really wanting to look at is student leadership. So if you would go to the next slide. And the reason why I'm interested in student leadership is because oftentimes these are the students on the front lines in the context of these are the students that are leaders in identity-based student organizations. These are the students who university administrators, when they say, hey, I need a group of students for this, student affairs professionals tap these particular students. These are also the students that experience racism might turn to when thinking about building a coalition of students to address what might be happening. There's plenty of literature on students of color and thinking about their experiences. The literature is growing when thinking about student leaders of color and what they are experiencing. And a lot of the research on student leaders of color is specifically looking at their experiences as identity and identity-based student organizations. When some of my own participants were also members of student government or members of the Residence Hall Association, which are not necessarily identity-based student organizations, but they are students of color that are navigating those student organizations. Want to go to the next slide? So what is racial battle fatigue, right? I think we saw that and we could feel it with the students' raw emotion, but specifically racial battle fatigue, coined by Dr. William Smith, is really thinking about these psychosocial stressors that people of color experience by the ongoing experiences of racism. And they could be different levels, right? So for some students, it's apathy, right? We don't necessarily see them dealing with the anger or with the fear. For some students, it's rage, right? This fatigue of having to constantly be the one to call out, not only experience racism, but then having to be the one to call it out. And this fatigue that often sets in. And for some students, it becomes resentment, right? I don't want to go back to that institution in the fall. I didn't have a positive experience there. I was constantly having to navigate not only personal racism, but institutional racism at the institution. Next slide, please. Specifically for the context of higher education, the research was originally done with a group of Black faculty and how they were experiencing racial battle fatigue. It went on to think about campuses in general, but racial battle fatigue happens in all aspects of society, and it doesn't happen, for some students, it's happening before they even get here on our campuses, right? They're experiencing in their lives and as they're navigating, and it doesn't go away once they leave our campuses, specifically. So what I was specifically interested in, next slide please, in thinking about with the study that I conducted was really looking at how do Black and Latinx students cope with racial battle fatigue as student leaders at historically Black universities in both positional and non-positional roles. And the reason why I was interested in both positional and non-positional is thinking about, there's obviously students with titles that are leading student organizations, but oftentimes there are student activists or students doing activism on campus, but not have a title in the student organization, and they are also on the front lines experiencing this racial battle fatigue. So I wanted to hear from both students' experiences. And the reason, sorry, just really quick, the reason I was interested in Black and Latinx students is because at these particular institutions that I was looking at, those were the students who were specifically calling to hold the administration accountable for the racism that was happening on their campus. And the students could opt in with their own, how they self-identified in the context of Black and Latinx. So I use racial battle fatigue as a framework to enter into understanding the students' experiences. And then I really thought about a methodology that centered race and racism as endemic in society. So all aspects of society, and our nice higher education institution is not excluded from understanding racism and what happens. So the methods in which I employed was really thinking about a 3-interview series approach with the students. And what I mean by that is I interviewed each student 3 times. And the first interview was really getting a life history, really understanding the background, the experiences of the student. But also wanted to use the advantage of this kind of really thinking about how do I gain rapport with the students, and more contact I was able to have with the students, the more and more rapport I was able to gain with the student. 3-interview series takes time, FYI. But throughout it, I was really thinking about how students were understanding. So the second interview was specifically about their undergraduate experience and their understandings of leadership and their understandings of racism on campus. What were they experiencing in these particular contexts, and what do they look like? And then the last interview series was about meaning making. I would pull from the previous 2 interviews and say, hey, tell me more about this, or how did you make meaning of this experience, or what did you learn from this? So the students were able to reflect on not only their experience, but also what they were learning and meaning from that. To situate myself in this, my positionality, I was a student leader of color, right? I was a student that experienced racism. So I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't projecting my own experiences onto what the students were telling me. So I had some colleagues as peer debriefers to think about that. And I also had a graduate assistant who was a different race and gender than myself to also interrogate my own meaning making of what we were coding and analyzing with the student. And being able to articulate how their racial identity might have influenced how they were making meaning of how I was making meaning, and negotiating that messiness with the student as well. So then we get into the actual study. And for the purpose of our conversation today, so far I have 3 sites that I've collected data at. We're going to focus on the first site because I'm ongoing data collection and analysis. But for this particular site, this site was in New England, and it was a mid-sized kind of master's comprehensive institution. And it was pretty diverse, and 34% students of color. That 34% is just Black and Latinx students at this particular institution. And they had a pretty, they had some incidents specifically happening on that campus that semester during data collection. So there was a football field graffiti, spray painted the N-word across the football field. Students were in the midst of reacting and responding to that, and also questioning the university leadership of how they responded to the incident. So it was very salient, heightened. The other institution, next slide please, the other institution that I collected data at is a large public institute. No, this is a liberal arts college, a small liberal arts college in the Midwest, private institution. And then the third, which you all won't see, is a large public institution in the Southeast. I'm currently collecting data. So our students that I was able to, for our conversation, we're actually going to look at the first site of students. These particular students, I interviewed 8 of them, 3 interview series, 5 men, 3 women. The students, before we started interview, had to fill out a demographic sheet, and it was open-ended. So the students got to self-define their gender, they define their race and their ethnicity. I did get a couple questions, was what's the difference between race and ethnicity? And as you can see, some students were very specific. Like I am Black, I'm a Black Haitian, or I am Floridian. They had to point that out on a map for me of my ignorance, and really learning about the different ethnic groups in New England that was really salient that I didn't go into the study fully understanding and the role that played as well. If you want to go 2 slides, we can go 2 slides. So what I want to focus the conversation on today, there's a lot of findings that I have, but for the point of our conversation today, there's 3 specific findings that really evolved as far as the coping mechanisms. And I highlighted some of these when I came to do my job talk here, and as since I've gotten in deeper with the data and started analyzing, these have evolved as far as the data collection. So I'll just kind of highlight them here, and I'll go more in depth into each one as we have time here. So the students really long for this sense of normalcy, right? I'm tired of having to deal with this, right? So how I cope is by doing something normal that they feel like their white counterparts were doing because they didn't have to worry about the effects of racism on their schoolwork, on their leadership. The other one was they were constantly trying to reframe their experiences and their fatigue into a positive. So look at all the people that I'm helping, or look how I'm standing up for people, or we're gonna have to deal with racism. So I'm learning how to deal with it here, right, before I get into the workplace. So they're constantly reframing how they were navigating into this positive navigation that they were gaining. And then the last one was this intellectualizing oppression, and I'll highlight this in a second. But these were where you would consider like woke students in the sense of they had the language, right? Like they could define power, privilege, and oppression. They could point it out. They had heard racial battle fatigue before, and every time I would ask them how they feel, they would turn it into this intellectual definition, defining, understanding, and that's how they coped. Is because then they would go and feel like they could teach other people about this, and that's how they navigated. So just like we lived, right? So this is this cognizant that they were cognizant that their experiences as student leaders of color is different than their white peers, but they were trying to make things more normal, right? So I cope by going to the movies with my friends. I cope by going to the football game because I just want to be a normal college student and not have to think about racism all the time. And a quote here from, next slide, from Aaliyah. Aaliyah was talking about this idea of what she thought was a normal college student, but she didn't really know, right? This is what I perceive normalcy to be, and I just want to do that. She talked about wanting to exist as a normal college student. And I would push on her, well, what is a normal college student? And she would go automatically to white students as normal college students, right? And then when I questioned her in the last interview and problematized that, she had some difficulty reflecting back on why that was considered normal to her, and why she wanted to long for that perception that those students had a normal experience, and the default of normal was white, right? And I was able to not challenge, but I was able to really interrogate her thinking around why was that considered normal, right? The next one was students, like I said, reframing things into the positive. So they opted to do this when thinking about their experiences. And another layer of the reframing was like depersonalizing. So they could see racial battle fatigue in their peers. They could see it happening and then wanting support. When I asked them about themselves, they would then go back to how they saw it in others. And they had an issue with kind of taking on the personal. And I think that for me, when I was analyzing the data, to me, that was how they were coping with it, was to depersonalize it. So FMR, the next student, the students got to pick their own pseudonym. This is not an acronym. This is the student's name that they decided to choose. And they talked about wanting to fight for other students. And that's how they were able to, if I can keep up wanting to do this, I'm not, because somebody else doesn't want to address it, doesn't mean that I'm not going to address it. And they saw that as a positive because they were doing what they felt was right. And then our last was why I talked about intellectualizing oppression. So for the students, they really thought about this coping mechanism of racial battle fatigue, and they were able to articulate their own oppression. They were able to articulate who did it to them, why they might have did it to them, the structural systematic things that might be implied or might be implications for why this might be happening to them. They were really able to have these really in-depth conversations around this issue because they have an advanced knowledge of thinking about this. And through that, intellectualizing these particular experiences, it was hard for them to get to the feeling. So I was like, well, how did that make you feel, right? And they would go back to, well, oppression is blah, blah, blah. Well, let's go back to how that made you feel. They constantly went back to really intellectualizing what they were experiencing. So my girl Beyonce talked about this. She's like, I get it. Like, she's like, people of color, we have an experience, and we understand oppression because of the experiences that we're having. If you don't have those experiences, then you might not be able. It may be difficult for you to understand what oppression is. But I, as a person of color, know what it is, and this is what it is. And our intellectualizing oppression really came out to light when I really got to the meaning making part of it, and I pushed back and I was like, every time I asked you about feelings, you would tell me the definitions of something or how they looked. Have you explored thinking about your own particular feelings around these issues? And she started getting emotional in the interview and started talking about, if I have to think about how I feel about it, it's going to be that much more difficult for me to address it because I'm constantly feeling it. So her coping mechanism was keeping it at an intellectual basis in order that she could go out and she felt do the work of teaching others about these particular issues. So in a paper that I hope gets published soon, I really try to think about how can we learn how students are making meaning of these feelings of racial battle fatigue. And not for me, not in order to think about how do we heal these students, because for me, the healing process is a whole nother layer and it's an ongoing process. But how can we think about the campuses and the climates that we have on our campuses and how they might be sparking certain feelings of fatigue in our students, and how do we see it, how do we recognize it, how do we then create and hold space for students, think about how we support them through that. So I have some implications that I think are kind of macro in some instances. First, racial battle fatigue in some ways is a form of racial trauma, right? It might be acute for some students, and for some students it might be in a very large scale, but we send students to counseling services often. And do we have, the counseling services have the resources to specifically support racial trauma? And racial trauma looks in some ways different than other trauma, and we assume that all trauma feels and looks the same. And have we really interrogated, can counseling services on our campuses support students in racial trauma, and can we hold them accountable to thinking about those services for our students? The other one is really thinking about first responders. So students that are experiencing racial fatigue, who might they encounter first in wanting to get support? And oftentimes those are RAs, those are advisors, they might be faculty members. But how do we have a conversation about what does racial battle fatigue look like, and then how do we address it? But if you can't identify it for me, then you can't address it. So how do we have real conversations in trainings, in campus-wide conversations about what does it mean to encounter someone experiencing racial battle fatigue, and what is the support that particular students need? As you saw through our students, though, they ran the gamut. So some students cope making things normal. Some students, they stay up here in their head, and some students put even more energy in calling out and wanting to address racism. This last one is really big, broad in the sense of transformative change needed in addressing campus climate. what I mean by that is oftentimes we are not doing targeted response. So we see something in best practices and we think it's going to work here. And that's honestly getting understanding when we get campus climate reports of what's happening on our specific campus and what needs to change. And what needs to change at Florida State might look very different at the University of Florida. And because they're large public institutions, we will oftentimes want to put cookie cutter reaction. We want to address things in cookie cutter ways and not really do the real work of exploring what our students are actually experiencing in order to address them. So where am I headed with this? I was able to go this summer to the Intersectional Qualitative Research Institute at the University of Maryland, and really thinking about this work from an intersectional lens. What I mean by that is even parsing out further race. For the New England institution, I did not take into account that the experiences that Afro-Caribbean students were experiencing look very different than domestic students, in particular Latinx students, right? So really having conversations about that particular campus really made me think about community coping and what community coping might look like based on ethnicity. Thinking about class, so what resources or social capital might students have that speaks to how they might be coping. Is all at play when thinking about this. So taking a more intersectional lens is kind of where I'm headed with the research, and specifically understanding institutional context and how that sparks how students cope. So institutional context, not only meaning institutional type, but students that are very much ingrained in residence life, very much have experienced racism in certain ways, giving the community in which they live, and their coping looks very different, or might look very different than the institution that is experiencing the institution in the context of a commuter student or a non-traditional age student. So really thinking about context and what coping mechanisms are happening with students in order to provide services that are meaningful and more intentional. And I'm ready to have a conversation. So thank you all for your attention.
We can open it up for questions, which includes questions from the live stream.
So, how is the nature of racial biology of undergraduate leaders of students of color differ from those students of color who are not in a leadership role?
I don't necessarily know that because I didn't necessarily look at students that were not. But for me, what I think these particular student leaders of color that are taking on these leadership roles, there's an added tax for these particular students. So they were getting, from what they expressed to me, they were getting not only asked to do things in support or responding to the institution, what the institution wanted to know around a racist incident, but they were the ones that were like, if there were a campus forum, they were the students that were getting asked to speak at the campus forum, or they were the students getting asked to help with organization of the campus forum. And for some of them, they were willing to do it because they felt that was their role in leadership. For others, that they'll continuously being asked to do those things was even more triggering for them of the racism that they might have experienced. So I think for specifically, to answer your question, one example is those students had proximity to administration and getting added experiences with fatigue that the other students that might not be in positional or considered leaders on campus were not being asked to do. Ricardo?
So I imagine one major way to hopefully resolve this in time is educating white students and the faculty and staff. And white allies can only do so much, and it's important to include voices from students of color and people of color for this situation. So how do you balance having that, but also ensuring that these types of concerns of racial bias happen where the education is happening for those who need it, but it's not so much so where it feels now it becomes a burden, if that makes sense.
Yeah. In the University of Missouri clip, at the end they did this chant, you think this is a joke, you think it's a game. And I was reading an article that was talking about people saying, right, like the post-racial mentality, like we're past race, or racism is in your imagination type of thing. I think it's an honest conversation that campuses need to have about what is the climate here, right? And understanding that the climate for you might feel very different from the climate for other students. And racial climate literature says this, that white students were experiencing the campus very different than students of color. But then how do we have a collective community conversation about that, right? About really pinpointing what might be the differences of experiences be, and can students can white students really hear how other students might be experiencing the campus differently. And for those students that are willing to be allies and willing to listen and to learn, is to really think about how, I think some self-work, right? So how might you be contributing to what the campus climate might be for students of color? What do jokes look like? What does it mean for you not to, for if you think about every question I used to ask my students at Iowa State, is thinking about group work, right? If every group work assignment, if you get to senior year, every group work assignment that you did when you got to pick your own groups where people look like you, I'm not saying you're racist, I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying that we contribute in some ways by our implicit and explicit actions of how other people might be experiencing the climate. And white students have a real conversation about that, and really think critically about how their minor actions and their major actions might be contributing to the conversation. And can the community at large have a conversation like that? What would always annoy me is when we would get the campus climate information back, and then we would have the College of Education address or do a task force, the College of Medicine, but there was never a larger conversation across the campus about what was really happening from this data. And that's something that I think racial battle fatigue is only a small part of that, but it's a real part of that for students of color that are fatigued of having to constantly be the ones calling out and addressing racism, and we're not having a community-wide conversation about it. Thank you.
I believe NC State had a question. Let's see if our technology works and we can hear them.
NC State, we saw a raised hand.
I'm trying to communicate with them through the chat. Oh, there we go.
Okay. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good. Hello, Florida State people.
Hi, Joy, guys and gals. How are you?
We're great. We're excited to be here. So one of our, we have about maybe 15 people in the room, and one of our participants has a question, so I'll let him ask.
You should see it posted already in the chat, but I guess I can clarify what I meant there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just basically at the end there, you had mentioned in your future directions, but throughout your presentation, I was curious once I saw that you had this like students that distinguish being black, but also being from some particular cultural background versus being African American more generally. And I was curious if you saw anything come up between those groups in terms of how they form their identity, but also kind of enacted that identity in their combating of racial battle fatigue.
I'm still doing some of that analysis, but one example sorry, did everyone hear the question? He was asking me about how students that had identified themselves as with an ethnic background, specifically students might not have been African American, but might more identified as a Black Haitian or other. How did those students, I believe their social identity, and how do those things play into how they navigated racial battle fatigue? Is that the gist of the question? When I think about a couple of the Haitian students in particular, were very much articulated how in some of these leadership roles, it was for the purpose of supporting their family. So this one particular student talked about being an RA and what that meant for not having to pay rent, and then what she could give back to her family. So yes, she felt like she was a leader. She did other things on campus as well. but some of that normalcy was also attached to her family background. Her parents were immigrants, and some of that identity was attached to that sense of normalcy. So yes, I want to be normal and not have to deal with racism. But yes, there's some other layers that might have to do with my cultural background that she felt her peers didn't necessarily have to navigate, given her own experiences as one particular student. Some of the other students was very much rooted in their culture as far as how they came to understand first racism in the context of their family and their upbringing, and then understanding it in the context of higher education. For some of these students, felt very different. A lot of them, some of the discrimination they felt was not only because of their race, but because of their family and the immigration status, the family that might be that was at play for them making meaning of what race and racism was. Most of them were first generation or second generation immigrants for those students that had a direct tie to their ethnic background. But like I said at the end, I'm still exploring specifically and centering not only race but ethnicity as a part of how they were coping in those coping mechanisms.
I have a question about nuance too, and it may not be something that you can address in this paper, where I think you did a really wonderful and powerful job of telling the story about battle fatigue and what that means and what it looks like for this intersectional group of students. I imagine that you may want to talk about Dear White People at some point in here too, or I was enjoying at least the snippets from the movie and the TV show. But I wonder about like colorism and class, color, and different types of positional leadership. So I know it's a small group, but some of the students may be in more centralized, students may be in positional leadership roles or non-positional leadership roles around racial issues, right? So like leaders of a certain student group that is identity-based, but they also may be presidents of the class or resident assistants seem to be in your study. And so I wonder if you were able to tease out and hear what that looked like, if there's a different kind of experience for being in a non-race, non-identity-based sort of role or space versus leadership and like the battle fatigue that comes with explicitly having the work be done in a community where people are organized around doing that kind of work with you. So where you might be one of a number of different people doing kind of work, but where you are the person as the voice of racial issues versus doing it in a community space where you can kind of go through that together, which may be helpful, but also may be exhausting in a different way.
Yeah, some of the glaring kind of differences as I'm thinking about it is the students that were intellectualizing oppression where most of those students were in the identity based student organizations, and the students that were depersonalizing and reframing some things were students that were in student association or residence hall association that were not necessarily attached to identity based organizations. That is a broad overgeneralization. But when I'm thinking about the data and the student stories and how they were articulating how they were making meaning, I didn't get a lot of students that were a part of identity based that were depersonalizing how racial battle fatigue was impacting them. But some of the student leaders that were a part of campus-wide student organizations were not the identity-based organizations, not campus-wide, but they were maybe a part of student government or other organizations. They're like, oh, I see my peers navigating that, or I can see how fatigued my peers were. But then when I was questioning them, I was like, well, you told me about you were in the funding allocation meeting, and how you experienced racism in that meeting as the only person of color and no one else noticed, right? Like they were able to definitely pinpoint, but when they told me examples and weren't able to relate those examples back, those students had a difficult time of thinking about for themselves what was that experience. They felt like they could they saw their peers that they felt were on the ground doing some of this work, and they could pinpoint how they were experiencing it. When I took it back to them, those particular students had some difficulty really articulating and personalizing those experiences.
Yes, don't be shy. This is a big group with
I
lots of
think-
people who are interested.
NC State may have another
great.
question.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Joy. Karen, thanks so much for your work. I think this is super important. I have a question. You didn't really talk about like how kind of this notion of racial battle fatigue kind of manifested itself. But I'm curious about how these students took care of themselves in terms of you got to have a release for this stuff. You can't just engage at this level because like self-care, us care, like what did they do to recharge, to stay energized, to not burn out? And I'm also curious about the extent to which, like for me, the level of politics that I tend to fight, like I feel it in my body first, but I don't always have the language to articulate exactly what just happened, but I know something happened, right? And so I'm curious in terms of this notion of intellectualizing oppression. Like I think they're pretty cool to be able to do that because at my level, I can't do that all the time. I just know that something ain't right. So I guess that's like two questions.
And your first one was thinking about like basically like self-care, right? Like how do they stay? Okay. And a lot of this is like being in community was one way that they were able to navigate. So whether that be in community with themselves or being with their family. So for the institution in New England, at the public Master's Comprehensive Institution, a lot of those students went home on the weekends, and they felt like that was an opportunity for them to recharge. And some of them had familial obligations and why they did that, but they felt like that was their break from sometimes having to think about some of this stuff and then able to go back into it Monday morning or whenever when they came back from the weekend. They felt a lot of them talked about that as a way of coping and navigating some of this, is being able to take a break both physically and mentally from the actual campus environment. And others talked about just being in community with one another. I didn't go as in depth in the methods, but some of the snowballing came from because, hey, you need to talk to my homegirl because we and her talk about this stuff all the time. She would be great for this study. And talking about being in community with one another of addressing this. During this time, they were organizing a campus walkout. And a lot of them talked about how they met students from other student organizations through that process and how they were collectively coming together and how that really fueled them in thinking about, they didn't call it activism, but talked about really thinking about addressing racism on campus as a collective and how that gave them energy around this work. They didn't feel like it was just them. They knew it wasn't just them, but oftentimes they don't get to come together as collectives across organizations to think about some of these things. And then, Joy, your second question was thinking about this intellectualizing and the politics of it. Some of them were, I think like you said, some of them were really able to articulate the campus politics and was at play and why the campus administration might not be addressing what things in the ways that they thought they should address them. Some of them had no idea about the structure of the university besides what was in their bubble. And they just didn't understand why the president couldn't put out a statement, or they just didn't understand some of these things, or they didn't get the president's statement. They would name an incident that happened. I remember distinctly getting a campus-wide email, and the students was like, "Well, I didn't get that, so then it didn't happen." And the students were articulating things in that way, and then connecting it back to intellectualizing it. I didn't really delve into kind of the initial feelings besides like the stress in the body. But then like, where does it go from there type of conversations? We weren't able to have kind of the conversations of, the stress in the body moving to kind of intellectualizing it. With the intellectualizing it, I was able to go backwards with those students, but a lot of those students that kind of were able to articulate the feelings that they had or what it felt, some of those students didn't get to the intellectualizing part. And it could be where they are in development or where they are in some of the meeting making. But it was easier. I'm not even gonna say it was easier. I was able to walk back some of those students that were very heady, and then pushing them on the feeling. It was more difficult to push the people that were on the feeling into the heady because they didn't necessarily have the language or the background or the academic to really be able to articulate some of this stuff. I remember as one student, I was constantly having to define the battle fatigue part of they could not conceptualize kind of what that was, but they were able to talk about, when I asked the questions in the protocol, they very much talked about racial battle fatigue, but when I was talking them through in the later interviews, they were constantly, so what is it again? What is that word? They were very much not able to gain grasp the concept of this theoretical thing, but they were able to articulate what it was to them in the context of what they were experiencing. So it was just depending on where students were in their own identity development, but also grasping some of the material.
So my question, and I'm not too sure if this is like within the scope of your research, but what did the students, if at all, articulate in regards to like change that they wanted to see, or what they thought that they needed more of? Like, did they articulate that in any way? Like, I need this.
Yeah,
and
what they were articulating was across, could probably be themed throughout what we saw from student demands. So more faculty of color was one, more funding for student organization. This one thing that they did get was they wanted this kind of campus-wide diversity training, and the administration was looking at what would that look like. This particular institution would do community time. Some smaller campuses still do that. I don't know if Florida State ever did that, but community time would be Monday morning. So there were no classes, a 3-hour block Monday mornings every semester, and that's usually when there would be lectures that were coming, or they called it community time then. That would happen, and the students wanted to really use community time as campus-wide time to have some of these conversations. And by the end of the spring semester that year, following the students' walkout, students were able to push the administration to have this community time, and the students did something similar to what we saw in the Mizzou 1950, and they were able to push towards being able to share their stories and their experiences campus-wide. The administration could not make it mandatory, but there were a number of students and community members there. The students felt like that was moving in the direction of change that they were looking for, because the campus and the administration was willing to have the conversation with them and not necessarily blow them off or continue to push off things. And they were able to hold the administration accountable for a couple of those demands. I remember having a conversation with one of the students, and she was like, these are our demands. Do you think they're realistic? And I was like, well, do you think they're realistic? I'm here to interview you. Then she wanted to get my opinion. I asked her, well, when thinking about, you want double the number of faculty of color, well, have you thought about like what is the faculty of color nationally that have a PhD in this perspective discipline, right? So then really thinking about the systemic things, you're calling for change, you're calling for representation, but have we thought about why there might not be representation? What are the systemic reasons why? And how can you demand something, administration is something that they can't just immediately dismiss, right? So doubling the number of faculty of color, well, how realistic is that, and how we hold people accountable? So if it doesn't happen in 2 or 3 years, their new cycle of students are here and we're having the same conversation. So what demands can we think about asking for that spark the change that you want, but also are able to have a longer systemic implications that last beyond you being here? So some of the students thought about that in the context of change, but I wanted them to think about change in the context of accountability, and the students really some of the students weren't there yet, right? They're like, we want this because we saw this campus ask for this, and we need that here. Really thinking about the complexity of all of that.
Okay, so Dr. Cameron, my question is somewhat along the lines of what Courtney was asking, but in a different way. So in the beginning, when you showed us the film piece, and the students did the presentation, which was basically showing, sharing awareness and really being animated, expressing the way the situations made them feel. So for that particular women's group, what was the outcome, or do you happen to know what the outcome was after that, or was it just specifically for awareness, or were they trying to come up with a way to address the way that the students were feeling?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the outcome was. If you watch the documentary, the documentary starts with them practicing for this, and then all these other racial incidents are happening while they're practicing for this. My takeaway from seeing the documentary multiple times is that the students wanted to, it was a consciousness raising that they were trying to do. And the leader of this particular group was open to that consciousness raising for this particular group. And then I think as the film goes on, you can see some allyship building amongst the students and the student groups. And yeah, so I'm not completely sure what the final thing was, but the final thing with university it's not a final thing, but if you are aware, the university president was fired and removed. This was national publicity. The enrollment, I believe, dropped a high percentage the next semester, where they ended up closing down 2 to 3 residence halls and other things. And I think they're still recovering out of that. But diversity, equity, and inclusion, policy-wise and practice-wise, looks very different at the University of looked at in 2015.
I have a question unless anyone else has. Do we have it like 5 minutes? Oh, go ahead.
I also think NC State has
Awesome.
another question
Oh,
for
good.
us
I
as
didn't
well.
know.
Does NC State have another question?
Yeah, sorry. You had mentioned you responded to Joy earlier. The 3 kind of coping mechanisms that you saw rise out of your interviewing with the students, and I appreciate that you kind of put them on a level playing field in terms of presentation. But I'm curious if you have any, like, in terms of the implications that you came up with, do you have any kind of trajectory for how these 3 mechanisms would play out? Like, how would you project change, or how change would be best made? Because you have there in the first one kind of like a, not necessarily passive, but kind of accepting or more of a submissive view. And then in the second one, it's more of a transformative, and then the third one is very intellectual. And you had just said, like, interviewing the ones that were presenting the intellectual coping, that that's all well and good, but were you trying to have anything else emerge? Not influencing your participants, of course, but would you be suggesting a kind of a transformative view first and then intellectual, or the other way around? You follow what I'm saying?
I think for me, since it wasn't exploratory, there was the maturity of actually seeing how they were coping. I think key is number one, understanding that not all students are coping, not all students of color are coping the same way. So a student that might be quote unquote passive is still dealing with racial battle fatigue. That student still needs support in how to navigate that. So I think understanding the landscape of what racial battle fatigue is and how there might be a continuum of how students are coping, navigating this particular fatigue, I think is important, right? So the student not wanting to go to a class goes beyond a student not wanting to go to a class, right? It might be something deeper that goes beyond specifically their transition to college or whatever the case might be, but really centering racial battle fatigue as a possible factor of how students are navigating campus life, I think is one that I don't think we fully take into consideration when we think about the undergraduate experience. And there's other there's some other research. I think Collins' research really gets at thinking about this particular fatigue and how it has specific health implications, whether that be our physical health or mental health, and this ongoing experience of racism and battling racism For some people, it becomes this innate object or this innate being of racism when it's really people's realities. If students are not understanding how to cope with these things in meaningful ways, or being able to address or articulate, and we're not supporting them, they can have lasting impacts beyond the student's undergraduate experience. So for me, these implications, I think, for first responders, for me, I think is the biggest of really exploring the student experience beyond what we say first-year students or student leaders might be experiencing, but for some students, centering race and racism as a part of supporting them and understanding their experience can mean the difference of how they cope with those experiences. So I don't think necessarily there's a linear path to addressing passive to active, but I think it's specific, and then when we center that particular student, recognizing that Cameron is going to experience this very different than Lara, and how do I enter into a space to interact and support Cameron's racial battle fatigue of how he is experiencing it. I think that's important. But I think sometimes we want a cookie cutter, or we want a best practices approach, and I don't think racial battle fatigue is supported in that way. And getting that out of the mindset of people that are responding and supporting students, I think it might be the first step.
I think that carries over for students and faculty and staff as well too, as I think many folks, we have lots of institutional actors in the room, probably seeing the same kind of trends in other spaces. There was one, I think Brad had one last question, and then we've got to close.
Gotcha. I'm curious to see how charged the fatigue was as it relates to students' expectations of the university's response or ownership to actually answering this question. So I think about part of Courtney's question earlier was, well, what do they want? And that sometimes often is very much response students hear is, well, what do you want? Without there being an acknowledgement of, well, racism's been around for a while. This is not just a brand new concept. And how our institutions own history as it relates to these sorts of issues being connected to their communities, and whether these institutions are saying, well, when an incident pops up, we're going to default to the students to figure it out and let us know what you want us to do. So just thoughts on that.
Yeah, loaded question. No, but I think that's what racism has become. Racism has become. We are responding, reacting to incident or racism, and for these students, like I said, it was heightened. Some of the fatigue was heightened because of that specific racist incident, that particular campus, that particular semester. But racial battle fatigue happens every day, no matter what's happening on campus. So can we really think about the policies and the practices that we have in place that heightens those particular students having to constantly feel racial microaggressions, right? Like constantly to feel that puts on the fatigue, right? And it might be constantly, I remember my doc program, I'm constantly mixed up with the other Black man in my program who is 7 shades lighter than I am. We look nothing alike. But for the person that constantly mixed us up, that became annoying to me, of course. But oftentimes behavior was excused. Oh, that's just such and such. That's the person that mixes everyone up, right? And it became dismissive of what I was experiencing. And how do we get away from those very intrapersonal examples, or how we address those examples by also having a larger conversation about the historic nature of naming buildings or other things that happen on college campuses, and what's at play every cycle. I remember at Iowa State University, the Carrie Chapman Cat Center. I remember it was like almost, you could see it in the student newspaper. Every 10 years, the same students were calling for the renaming, right? It was just an ongoing cycle, instead of us having a larger conversation about the history of this person, how this building got named, and what does it mean to keep the name on the building, right? We weren't having those larger conversations. So we're not having larger conversations, and then we're not having the personal conversations. Obviously, these things continue, and the fatigue of it all becomes that much more heightened. And our students are, quote unquote, more woke in some instances, and are not going to sit with dismissing me or being dismissive, but want to be we have these demands and we want every demand to be met. And if we can't have a larger scale historical conversation or a personal conversation, it becomes a cycle in which it already is. Thank you all for engaging.
Feel free to keep engaging beyond. You can find Dr. Cameron Carl's